In this lesson, we are going to talk about secondary chords and how they fit into the broader category of chromaticism. We use this term chromaticism to describe music that includes pitches not found in the original key. And when we use a term like secondary chords, that generally means the same thing as applied chords, tonicizing, or tonicization. All these are used somewhat synonymously to describe situations in music in which some pitch other than tonic may be briefly treated as tonic. To set up this conversation, we're going to notice the forward motion and energy inherent in our diatonic scale. With this motion and energy comes expectation on the part of the listener, and that creates a dialogue between the listener and the composer. So this should make more sense to us when we consider the construction of the major scale. And here's what it sounds like. And you could tell when I got to this leading tone, this B, that there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of expectation, and there was a lot of forward motion that was driving this B toward the C. And of course, if somebody played this and they stopped on the B, a lot of people would be aggravated by that. Anybody who's heard Western music knows that this B, this leading tone, must resolve up to C. That's a really simple way of understanding the basis for this discussion of applied chords or secondary chords. Let's look at it in another context. We have this G major minor seventh chord that we know to call the 5-7 or the dominant seventh in the key of C. So most people could tell by listening to this dominant seventh that it must resolve to the 1 chord. And if you've taken any kind of theory fundamentals class, you know that the 7th of this chord should resolve down to the 3rd of the 1 chord, and the leading tone should resolve up to the root. And so I have this basic 5-to-1 progression blocked out on one staff. Of course, I'd do it differently if this was a part writing exercise on 2 staves. And here's how that sounds. So once again, this discussion of applied chords really relies on the expectation and forward energy that we as listeners experience when we hear the 5-7 and we understand the resolution that must occur to the 1 chord. All of these things are inherent in common practice Western music, such as we might study from the Baroque, Classical, or Romantic periods. So I mentioned in passing earlier that this is a major minor seventh chord. And you should already know what that means. You should know how these intervals are constructed and how to build a major minor seventh chord. The idea of applied chords is this. Let's take a 2 chord. And again, these are just blocked out. If you actually part wrote this way, you'd have parallels everywhere. Consider the idea of adjusting this 2 chord so that we have the same intervals that we found in the major minor seventh chord. What if we adjusted the 2 chord so that it became a major minor seventh chord? We alter the F to become an F sharp, and now we have a major minor seventh chord, and you can see that this is no longer a minor 2. Now some textbooks will call this a major 2. However, I prefer not to call this a major 2 because that does not really help us understand the function of this chord. Rather, I'm going to call this a 5-7 of 5. And what we've done is essentially given this 5 chord its own 5 chord. You can see that I've altered the F to become an F sharp. That would be one way of introducing this term chromaticism because the F sharp is not in the key of C major. This F sharp functions as a sort of temporary leading tone that leads us to the G chord. And here's how it sounds. And now you should be able to hear that we have some of the same forward motion and energy in what we're calling our 5-7 of 5, leading us to 5, the same way that our dominant would normally lead us to the 1 of the major key. So let's try another example, this time in the key of D major. So we have our 1 chord, and that's preceded by our 5 chord. So now our job is to create a dominant seventh for this 2. And again, the idea is we want a little bit more forward drive and energy into the 2. We want to signal to the listener that this 2 chord is coming, so it's crystal clear to them what the next chord should be in the same way that the dominant makes the 1 feel inevitable. So how do we create a dominant chord for the second scale degree? Here's our thought process. If E is temporarily being treated as tonic, then what is E's dominant? If E is 1, then what's 5? And hopefully you're remembering that B is the dominant of E. So I'm going to construct a triad on B. So now the next thing to think is, what should be the quality of this triad? Right now, B, D, F sharp just forms a minor triad, and that's not going to serve the function of a dominant chord. So we need to raise the D to a D sharp, and once again we're creating a chromatic pitch that's not in the key of D major, but we're doing that because D sharp is functioning as the temporary leading tone for E. And let's go ahead and give it a seventh so that we have a dominant seventh. So now instead of calling this B chord some kind of 6 chord, we're going to call it the 5-7 of 2. So what we're doing in the key of D major is we're very, very briefly making E sound like a focal point, sound like a tonic. We're sort of, just for a few beats, however long it lasts, making the piece feel like it's very briefly in E minor, but then it moves right along back to tonic, which is in D major, of course. Now I'm going to add one more element here. Going back to the key of C, I want to add the fact that the 7 diminished chord has a similar function. Both the 5 and the 7 diminished have what has been called a dominant function. That is, both of them want to lead our ear toward the 1 chord. And prominently featured in both is this leading tone that wants to lead up. So if we want to do a secondary dominant, we would do it as I described, and you can do the exact same thing with a secondary leading tone chord. Let's try a few more exercises. So now in the key of E flat major, let's do a 5-7 of 6, and in the same key, let's do a 7 diminished of 5, and we'll resolve that as well. So the first thing we should do is figure out where this chord is going. So we should know pretty quickly that the 6th chord in the key of E flat major is a C minor chord. So now we need to think, if we were giving C minor its own temporary dominant, where would that chord be rooted? If C is 1, then G would be 5. So we write out a 7th chord that's rooted on G, and then we need to consider the quality of the chord. This is currently a minor minor 7th chord. So hopefully we could quickly recognize the fact that to make this a major minor 7th chord, we need to raise that third by making it a B natural, and now this is functioning as a 5-7 of 6. And here's how it sounds. Now let's look at the 7 diminished of 5. In E flat major, the 5 chord is rooted on B flat. So we write that out first, and then we consider what pitch would be the 7 diminished or leading tone of 5. So here's our A natural. We have A up to C up to E flat, so now this is a diminished triad, and it is the 7 diminished of 5. Let's change gears for a minute and do a quick analysis of a well-known hymn tune by Martin Luther. Anytime we analyze traditional tonal music, we would want to start by looking at the key signature, which is obviously in the key of D major. As we scan through this excerpt, we see that almost all the chords are in the original key, but that there are a couple of chromatic pitches that should be obvious to us. In the context of this video, these are the chords that we're going to take apart and analyze. We had an E major chord, and we have the octave doubled, and we have the key of D. So the question is, what is this E major chord doing in the key of D? To make things a little more interesting, on the E major chord, we had this note that was double at the octave coming down to D on the offbeat. So we have what in essence is forming a major minor 7th chord. So the question is, what is an E major minor 7th chord functioning as in the key of D? If E is a dominant, then what's a temporary tonic? And the answer is A. A is the tonic of this E chord. And so we could refer back to the Martin Luther hymn and see that in fact A major chord does come after the E major. So clearly what we're seeing here is a 5-7 of 5 that's followed by the dominant 5. Now let's go to the second chord. For the second chord, what we had was D sharp, F sharp, and B on top. So of course B is the root. This is a first inversion chord, and it's a major chord. So once again, the same question. What is a B major chord doing in the key of D major? If B was functioning as the dominant, what would be the temporary tonic? And the answer is E minor in the key of D would be our temporary tonic. And of course this E chord would be called the 2, so that this B major chord, in this case, would be called the 5/6 of 2. So again, the thought process for our analysis is find the chromatic pitches that don't belong in the key, see the quality of the chord that's formed by those chromatic pitches, and then consider whether or not those chords could be functioning as the dominant or temporary dominant of another scale degree that wouldn't normally be considered tonic. So I know I haven't covered every possible scenario when discussing secondary chords, but I want to leave you with a couple more quick things. Someone might ask, how do I create a 5 of 4? In this case, for a major key, if you're going to turn the 1 chord into a 5 of the 4, or a secondary dominant for the 4, you actually have to add the 7th, and you have to lower it so that this is a chord that cannot function in the key as it normally would. This is a chromatic alteration to the notes that would occur in the key, and now we have a 5/7 of 4. If we don't add this lowered 7th, our ears would never tell us that this is functioning as a secondary dominant. We would just hear it as the major 1. The last thing I'll mention on this video is that we cannot have a 5 of the diminished 7 because a diminished chord cannot function as a tonic. I hope this lesson has been helpful for you, and I'd be happy for you to leave comments or contact me with any questions that you have.